So now we are going to start the human physiology unit. ह्यूमन फिजियोलॉजी स्टार्ट करते हैं, ठीक है। तो बेसिकली मैं पहले ही बता देता हूँ, ये सीरीज़ रिवीजन के लिए, बस आपकी लाइंस जो है एनसीईआरटी की वो माइंड में चलने के लिए। तो आप मोबाइल को ऑफ करके, मीन्स स्क्रीन ऑफ करके, हेडफोन्स लगा के, आइज़ क्लोज करके ध्यान से वॉइस को सुन सकते हो। इससे एनसीईआरटी की जो लाइंस है वो आपके ब्रेन में सेट होगी और आप सुन पाओगे, आपको लगेगा आप एनसीईआरटी पढ़ रहे हैं, ठीक है। तो चैप्टर 14, ब्रीथिंग एंड exchange of gases. As you have read earlier, oxygen is utilized by the organism to indirectly break down simple molecules like glucose, amino acid, fatty acid, etc. to derive energy to perform various activities. Carbon dioxide CO2, which is harmful, is also released during the above catabolic reaction. It is therefore evident that oxygen has to be continuously provided to the cells and CO2 produced by the cells have to be released out. This process of exchange of oxygen from the atmosphere with CO2 produced by the cell is called breathing, commonly known as respiration. Place your hands on your chest. You can feel the chest is moving up and down. You know that it is due to breathing. How do we breathe? The respiratory organ and the mechanism of breathing are described in the following sections of the chapter. So, first we are going to start with the respiratory organs. So, let's proceed further. Mechanism of breathing vary among different groups of animals depending mainly on their habitats and level of organization. Lower invertebrates like sponges, coelenterate, flatworms, etc. exchange oxygen with CO2 by simple diffusion. कैसे? By simple diffusion. कौन कौन? Lower invertebrates like sponges, coelenterate, flatworms, etc. exchange O2 with CO2 by simple diffusion over their entire body surface. Earthworm use their moist cuticle, and insect have a network of tubes, tracheal tubes, to transport atmospheric air within the body. A special vascularized structure called gills, branchial respiration, are used by most of the aquatic arthropods and mollusks, whereas vascularized beaks called lungs, pulmonary respiration, are used by terrestrial forms for the exchange of gases. Among vertebrates, fishes use gills, whereas amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals respire through lungs. कौन कौन करते हैं lungs से? Amphibian, reptiles, birds and mammals. Amphibian like frogs can respire through their moist skin. Can respire through their moist skin, that is cutaneous respiration also. Next we are going to start with human respiratory system. We have a pair of external nostrils opening out above the upper lips. It leads to the nasal chamber through the nasal passage. The nasal chamber opens into the pharynx, a portion which is the common passage for food and air. कौन सा है common passage for food and air? Pharynx. The pharynx opens through the larynx, right into the trachea. Larynx is a cartilaginous box which helps in sound production and hence called the sound box. During swallowing, glottis can be covered by thin, elastic cartilaginous flap called epiglottis to prevent the entry of food into the larynx. Trachea is a straight tube extending up to the mid-thoracic cavity, which divides at the level of fifth thoracic vertebrae into a right and left primary bronchi. Trachea is a straight tube extending up to the mid-thoracic cavity, which divides at the level of fifth thoracic vertebrae in the right and left primary bronchi. Each bronchi undergo repeated division to form secondary and tertiary bronchi and bronchioles, ending up in a very thin terminal bronchioles. The trachea, primary, secondary and tertiary bronchi and the initial bronchioles are supported by incomplete cartilaginous rings. इनकम्प्लीट की जगह कंप्लीट भी कर सकता है वो चेंज करके, बट करेक्ट आंसर है इनकम्प्लीट cartilaginous rings. Each terminal bronchiole give rise to a number of very thin, irregular walled and vascularized bag-like structure called alveoli. The branching network of bronchioles and alveoli comprise the lungs. We have two lungs which are covered by a double-layered pleura with pleural fluid between them. It reduces friction on the lung surface. The outer pleural membrane is in close contact with the thoracic lining, whereas the inner pleural membrane is in contact with the lung surface. आउटर प्लूरल मेम्ब्रेन है किसके कांटेक्ट में है? क्लॉज थोरासिक लाइनिंग्स की, और जो इनर प्लूरल मेम्ब्रेन है वो है लंग के सरफेस के कांटेक्ट में. ठीक है. द पार्ट स्टार्टिंग विद द एक्सटर्नल नॉस्ट्रिल्स अप टू द टर्मिनल ब्रोंक्यूल्स constitute the conducting part, whereas the alveoli and their duct form the respiratory or exchange part of the respiratory system. कौन सा पार्ट? द पार्ट स्टार्टिंग विद द एक्सटर्नल नॉस्ट्रिल्स अप टू द टर्मिनल ब्रोंक्यूल्स. एक्सटर्नल नॉस्ट्रिल्स से लेके टर्मिनल ब्रोंक्यूल्स से क्या करता है? कंस्टिट्यूट कंडक्टिंग पार्ट. Whereas the alveoli and their duct form the respiratory or exchange part of the respiratory system. The conducting part transports the atmospheric air to the alveoli, clears it from the foreign particles, humidifies, and also brings the air to body temperature. Exchange part is the site of actual diffusion of O2 and CO2 between blood and atmospheric air. Exchange part is the site of actual diffusion of oxygen and CO2 between the blood and atmospheric air. The lungs are situated in a thoracic chamber, which is anatomically an airtight chamber. The thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column, ventrally by the sternum. The thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column and ventrally by the sternum, laterally by the ribs, and on the lower side by the dome-shaped diaphragm. ठीक है, उतर गया दिमाग में? चलो एक बार और पढ़ देते. The thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column, ventrally by the sternum, laterally by the ribs, and on the lower side by the dome-shaped diaphragm. The anatomically setup of lungs in thorax is such that any change in the volume of the thoracic cavity will be reflected in the lung pulmonary cavity. Such an arrangement is essential for breathing, as we cannot directly alter the pulmonary volume. Respiration involves the following steps. First is breathing or pulmonary ventilation, by which atmospheric air is drawn in and CO2 rich alveoli air is released out. CO2 rich alveolar air is released out. Second point is diffusion of gases, oxygen and CO2 across alveolar membrane. Third is transport of gases by the blood. Fourth is diffusion of oxygen and CO2 between blood and tissues. Fifth is utilization of oxygen by the cells for catabolic process, for catabolic reaction, and resultant release of CO2, cellular respiration, still in chapter 12. ये अरेंज करने के लिए आ सकती है सीक्वेंस, इसलिए वापस से पढ़ देता हूँ स्पीड में। ओके, ठीक है, सुनना। फर्स्ट इज ब्रीथिंग और पल्मोनरी वेंटिलेशन, by which atmospheric air is drawn in and CO2 rich alveolar air is released out. Second is diffusion of gases across alveolar membrane. Third is transport of gases by the blood. Fourth is diffusion of O2 and CO2 between blood and tissues. Fifth is utilization of oxygen by the cells for catabolic reaction and resultant release of CO2. So the next is we are going to read mechanism of breathing. So let's start. Breathing involves two stages. Inspiration, during which atmospheric air is drawn in, and expiration, by which the alveolar air is released out. The movement of air into and out of the lung is carried out by creating a pressure gradient between the lungs and the atmosphere. किसके बीच में? लंग्स और एटमॉस्फेयर के बीच में प्रेशर ग्रेडियंट क्रिएट करके। इंस्पिरेशन कैन ऑक्यूर इफ द प्रेशर विद इन द लंग, दैट इज इंट्रापल्मोनरी प्रेशर, इज लेस देन द एटमॉस्फेरिक प्रेशर, दैट इज देयर इज अ नेगेटिव प्रेशर इन द लंग्स with respect to the atmospheric pressure. Inspiration can occur if the pressure within the lung is less than the atmospheric pressure, means there is a negative pressure in the lung with respect to atmospheric pressure. Similarly, expiration takes place when the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. जब अंदर प्रेशर ज़्यादा होगा तो एक्सपिरेशन होगा। डायफ्राम and a specialized set of muscles, external and internal intercostals between the ribs, helps in generation of such gradients. Inspiration is initiated by the contraction of diaphragm, which increases the volume of thoracic chamber in the anterior-posterior axis. The diaphragm and a specialized set of muscle, external and internal intercostal muscle between the ribs, help in generation of such gradient. Inspiration is initiated by the contraction of diaphragm, which increases the volume of thoracic chamber in the anterior-posterior axis. The contraction of external intercostal muscle lift up the ribs and the sternum. The contraction of external intercostal muscle lifts up the ribs and the sternum, causing an increase in the volume of the thoracic chamber in the dorsoventral axis. ठीक है? The contraction of external intercostal muscle lift up the ribs and the sternum, causing an increase in the volume of the thoracic chamber in the dorsoventral axis. The overall increase in the thoracic volume causes a similar increase in pulmonary volume. An increase in pulmonary volume decreases the intrapulmonary pressure to less than the atmospheric pressure, which forces the air from outside to move into the lung. That is inspiration. Understood? ठीक है? The overall increase in the thoracic volume causes similar increase in the pulmonary volume. An increase in pulmonary volume decreases the intrapulmonary pressure. क्या करेगा? इंक्रीज पल्मोनरी वॉल्यूम होगा तो डिक्रीज इंट्रापल्मोनरी प्रेशर होगा, क्योंकि प्रेशर और वॉल्यूम इनवर्सली प्रोपोर्शनल होते हैं. टू लेस देन द एटमॉस्फेरिक प्रेशर विच फोर्सेस द एयर फ्रॉम आउटसाइड टू मूव इनटू द लंग, दैट इज इंस्पिरेशन. Relaxation of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles returns the diaphragm and the sternum to their normal position and reduce the thoracic volume and thereby the pulmonary volume. Relaxation of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscle return the diaphragm and sternum to their normal position and reduce the thoracic volume and thereby the pulmonary volume. Return diaphragm and sternum to their normal position and reduce the thoracic volume and thereby the pulmonary volume. Understood? This leads to an increase in intrapulmonary pressure to slightly above the atmospheric pressure, causing the expulsion of air from the lungs, that is expiration. This leads to an increase in intrapulmonary pressure to a slightly above the atmospheric pressure, causing the expulsion of air from the lung, that is expiration. We have the ability to increase the strength of inspiration and expiration with the help of additional muscles in the abdomen. कहाँ पे? In the abdomen. On an average, a healthy human being breathe 12 to 16 times minute. A healthy human breathe 12 to 16 times per minute. The volume of air involved in breathing movements can be estimated by using a spirometer, which helps in clinical assessment of pulmonary functions. Understood? इंस्पिरेशन और एक्सपिरेशन का डायग्राम दे रखा है यहाँ पे, ठीक है। पहला है इंस्पिरेशन का, जिसमें एयर एंटर कर रही है लंग को, एरो है अंदर, और रिप्स एंड स्टर्नम जो है रेज्ड किए गए हैं और वॉल्यूम ऑफ थोरासिक इंक्रीज हुआ है, ठीक है। और जो सेकंड डायग्राम है वो एक्सपिरेशन का, जहाँ पे एयर एक्सपेल्ड फ्रॉम द लंग, वहाँ से बाहर गई है लंग से। रिप्स एंड स्टर्नम जो है रिटर्न आ गए उनकी ओरिजिनल पोजीशन में, और वॉल्यूम ऑफ थॉरैक्स डिक्रीज्ड। अब पढ़ रहे हैं अपन रेस्पिरेटरी वॉल्यूम्स एंड कैपेसिटीज। पक्का क्वेश्चन आते हैं यहाँ से। टाइडल वॉल्यूम, वॉल्यूम ऑफ एयर इंस्पायर्ड और एक्सपायर्ड ड्यूरिंग ए नॉर्मल रेस्पिरेशन। वॉल्यूम ऑफ एयर इंस्पायर्ड और एक्सपायर्ड ड्यूरिंग ए नॉर्मल रेस्पिरेशन, it is approximately 500 ml, that is a healthy man can inspire or expire approximately 6000 to 8000 ml of air per minute. Inspire or expire approximately 6000 to 8000 ml of air per minute. Next is inspiratory reserve volume, IRV. Additional volume of air a person can inspire by a forcible inspiration. This averages 2500 ml to 3000 ml. Additional volume of air a person can inspire by a forcible inspiration. Average 2500 to 3000 ml. ये हो गया इंस्पिरेटरी रिजर्व वॉल्यूम। इसके लिए एक शॉर्ट भी बना दूंगा मैं, बहुत इजी होगी, डायरेक्ट ब्रेन में सेट हो जाएगी। उसमें ट्रिक बता दूंगा मैं कैसे याद रखना है, ठीक है। यहाँ पे एनसीईआरटी पढ़ रहे हैं अपन। तो नेक्स्ट इज एक्सपिरेटरी रिजर्व वॉल्यूम, ईआरवी। एडिशनल वॉल्यूम ऑफ एयर ए पर्सन कैन एक्सपायर बाय ए फोर्सिबल एक्सपिरेशन। दिस एवरेजेस 1000 ml to 1100 ml. Understood? Next is residual volume, RV. Volume of air remaining in the lung even after a forcible expiration. This averages 1100 ml to 1200 ml. ठीक है, 1000 से 1100 ml हो गया ERV, एक्सपिरेटरी रिजर्व वॉल्यूम, और रेसिडुअल वॉल्यूम हो गया 1100 से 1200। ठीक है, याद रहेगा। By adding up a few respiratory volumes described above, one can derive various pulmonary capacities which can be used in clinical diagnosis. First is inspiratory capacity, that is IC. Total volume of air a person can inspire after a normal expiration. Inspiratory capacity में वॉल्यूम ऑफ एयर पर्सन जो इंस्पायर कर रहा है आफ्टर ए नॉर्मल एक्सपिरेशन, उल्टा ही चल रहा है, इंस्पायर कर रहा था, एक्सपिरेशन से कनेक्शन बता रहा है, ऐसे याद रख सकते हो। दिस इंक्लूड्स टाइडल वॉल्यूम एंड इंस्पिरेटरी रिजर्व वॉल्यूम, टीवी प्लस IRV। ठीक है, नेक्स्ट इज एक्सपिरेटरी कैपेसिटी, टोटल वॉल्यूम ऑफ एयर ए पर्सन कैन एक्सपायर आफ्टर ए नॉर्मल इंस्पिरेशन। अब एक्सपिरेटरी है तो यहाँ पे इंस्पिरेशन से कनेक्शन बताया, ठीक है। टोटल वॉल्यूम ऑफ एयर person can expire after a normal inspiration. Understood? This includes tidal volume and expiratory reserve volume, TV plus ERV. Next is functional residual capacity, FRC. Volume of air that will remain in the lung after a normal expiration. आफ्टर ए नॉर्मल एक्सपीरेशन के बाद जो भी बचेगी वो होगी फंक्शनल रेसिडुअल कैपेसिटी. दिस इंक्लूड्स ERV प्लस RV मीन्स एक्सपीरेटरी रिजल्ट वॉल्यूम और रेसिडुअल वॉल्यूम दोनों मिला के फंक्शनल रेसिडुअल कैपेसिटी बनाते हैं. ठीक है. नेक्स्ट इज वाइटल कैपेसिटी, दैट इज VC, द मैक्सिमम वॉल्यूम ऑफ एयर ए पर्सन कैन ब्रीथ इन आफ्टर ए फोर्स्ड एक्सपीरेशन. मैक्सिमम जितना ए पर्सन ले सकता है सांस आफ्टर ए फोर्स्ड एक्सपीरेशन वो हो गई वाइटल कैपेसिटी. दिस इंक्लूड्स ERV, TV and IRV, or the maximum volume of air a person can breathe out after a forced inspiration. दो एक ही बात बता दी हो. ठीक है. मैक्सिमम वॉल्यूम ऑफ एयर पर्सन कैन ब्रीथ इन आफ्टर ए फर्स्ट एक्सपीरेशन, जितना बाहर छोड़ दिया उसके बाद ले सकता है वो होगी वाइटल कैपेसिटी. या फिर अदर वर्ड्स में मैक्सिमम वॉल्यूम ऑफ एयर ए पर्सन कैन ब्रीथ आउट, जितना बाहर निकाल सकता है लेने के बाद फर्स्ट इंस्पिरेशन के बाद वो होगी वाइटल कैपेसिटी. नेक्स्ट इज टोटल लंग कैपेसिटी, टोटल वॉल्यूम ऑफ एयर अकोमोडेटेड इन द लंग्स एट द एंड ऑफ ए फोर्स्ड इंस्पिरेशन. दिस इंक्लूड ERV, TV, RV and IRV और वाइटल कैपेसिटी प्लस रेसिडुअल वॉल्यूम. इसमें आता है टोटल लंग कैपेसिटी. सो द नेक्स्ट इज एक्सचेंज ऑफ गैसेस. Alveoli are the primary sites of exchange of gases. Exchange of gases also occur between blood and tissues. Oxygen and CO2 are exchanged in these sites by simple diffusion, mainly based on pressure concentration gradient. Solubility of the gases as well as thickness of the membrane involved in diffusion are also important factors that can affect the rate of diffusion. Solubility of gases as well as thickness of membrane involved in diffusion are also important factors that can affect rate of diffusion. Pressure contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gases is called partial pressure. Pressure contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gases is called partial pressure and is represented as PO2 for oxygen and PCO2 for carbon dioxide. Partial pressure of these two gases in the atmospheric air and the two sites of diffusion are given in the table and in figure 14.3. The data given in the table clearly indicates a concentration gradient for oxygen from alveoli to blood and from blood to tissues. Similarly, a gradient is present for CO2 in opposite direction, that is from tissue to blood and blood to alveoli. ठीक है. A concentration gradient for oxygen from alveoli to blood and blood to tissue, and similarly a gradient is present for CO2 in the opposite direction, that is from tissue to blood and blood to the alveoli. अब जो टेबल है वो पढ़ रहा हूँ. ठीक है, ध्यान से सुनना. अंडरस्टूड. सो फर्स्ट रेस्पिरेटरी गैस है ऑक्सीजन, जिसका एटमॉस्फेरिक एयर में क्या है, यहाँ पे जो टेबल में दिया हुआ है पार्शियल प्रेशर इन mmHg of oxygen and carbon dioxide are different parts involved in diffusion in comparison to this to those in atmosphere. रेस्पिरेटरी गैस है ऑक्सीजन, जिसका एटमॉस्फेरिक एयर में पार्शियल प्रेशर होता है 159 इन mmHg, एल्वेली में होता है 104 एंड ब्लड जो डीऑक्सीजनेटेड होता है उसमें होता है 40. डीऑक्सीजनेटेड ब्लड में 40 एंड ऑक्सीजनेटेड ब्लड में 95, टिश्यूज में 40. नेक्स्ट रेस्पिरेटरी गैस है CO2, जिसका एटमॉस्फेरिक एयर में होता है 0.3, एल्वेली में होता है 40, ब्लड जो ऑक्सीजनेटेड होता है उसमें होता है 40 और ब्लड जो डीऑक्सीजनेटेड होता है उसमें CO2 का परसेंटेज होता है 45. ब्लड डीऑक्सीजनेटेड है उसमें 45, ब्लड जो ऑक्सीजनेटेड है उसमें 40 और टिश्यूज में है 45. अंडरस्टूड. एज द सॉल्युबिलिटी ऑफ CO2 is 20 to 25 times higher than that of oxygen, the amount of CO2 that can diffuse through the membrane diffuse through the diffusion membrane per unit difference in partial pressure is much higher compared to that of oxygen. The diffusion membrane is made up of three major layers, namely a thin squamous epithelium of alveoli, the endothelium of alveolar capillaries, and the basement substance composed of a thin basement membrane supporting the squamous epithelium and the basement membrane surrounding the single layer endothelial cells of capillaries. थ्री जो मेजर लेयर है स्क्वामस, जो कि फर्स्ट है थिन स्क्वामस एपिथेलियम ऑफ alveoli, the endothelium of alveolar capillaries, and the basement substance composed of a thin basement membrane supporting the squamous epithelium and the basement membrane surrounding the single layer endothelial cells of capillaries. जो डायग्राम दिया हुआ है यहाँ पे, अंदर alveolar cavity है, उसके बाद basement substance दिए हुए हैं, endothelium of ब्लड कैपिलरी दिया हुआ है और बीच में आरबीसी दिए हुए हैं, रेड ब्लड सेल्स, ब्लड कैपिलरी बताई हुई है, स्क्वामस एपिथेलियम ऑफ एल्वियोलर वॉल जो वन सेल, ठीक है, वो बताया हुआ है, ठीक है, डायग्राम भी पढ़ दिया मैंने, ठीक है, सुन लिया. However, its total thickness is much less than a millimeter. Therefore, all the factors in our body are favorable for diffusion of oxygen from alveoli to tissue and that of CO2 from tissue to alveoli. Next is transport of gases. Blood is the medium of transport of CO2 and O2. Blood is medium of transport of O2 and CO2. About 97% of oxygen is transported by the RBC in the blood. The remaining 3% of oxygen is carried in a dissolved state through the plasma. Nearly 20 to 25% of CO2 is transported by RBC, whereas 70% of it is carried as bicarbonate. 20 से 25% CO2 is transported by RBCs, whereas 70% of it is carried as bicarbonate. About 7% of CO2 is carried in a dissolved state through the plasma. So the next is transport of oxygen. Hemoglobin is a red colored iron containing pigment present in the RBCs. Oxygen can bind with hemoglobin in a reversible manner to form oxyhemoglobin. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry a maximum of 4 molecules of oxygen. Binding of oxygen with hemoglobin is partially related to the partial pressure of oxygen. किससे related है? Primarily related to the partial pressure of oxygen. Partial pressure of CO2, hydrogen ion concentration, and temperature are the other factors which can interfere with this binding. A sigmoid curve is obtained when percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is plotted against the PO2. कैसी कर्व होगी? सिग्मोइड कर्व. जब परसेंटेज सेचुरेशन ऑफ हीमोग्लोबिन विथ ऑक्सीजन का जो ग्राफ प्लॉट करेंगे. दिस कर्व इज कॉल्ड द ऑक्सीजन डिसोसिएशन कर्व and is highly useful in studying the effect of factors like PCO2, H positive concentration, etc. on binding of oxygen with hemoglobin. In the alveoli, where there is high PO2, low PCO2, lesser H plus concentration and lower temperature. In the alveoli, where there is a high partial pressure of oxygen and low partial pressure of carbon dioxide, lesser hydrogen ion concentration and lower temperature. The factors are all favorable for the formation of oxyhemoglobin. किसमें फेवरेबल है? ऑक्सीहीमोग्लोबिन के फॉर्मेशन में फेवरेबल है. Whereas in the tissues where low partial pressure of oxygen and high partial pressure of PCO2, carbon dioxide, high hydrogen ion concentration and higher temperature exit, The conditions are favorable for the dissociation of oxygen from the oxyhemoglobin. टिश्यूज़ में क्या होता है, लो PO2 होती है, हाई PCO2 होती है, हाई H+ कॉन्सेंट्रेशन होता है और हायर टेम्परेचर होता है, जो कंडीशन है फेवरेबल फॉर डिसोशिएशन ऑफ ऑक्सीजन फ्रॉम द oxyhemoglobin. This clearly indicates that oxygen gets bound to the hemoglobin in the lung surface and gets dissociated at the tissues. Every 100 ml of oxygenated blood can deliver around 5 ml of oxygen to the tissue under the normal physiological condition. Every 100 ml of oxygenated blood can deliver around 5 ml of oxygen to the tissues under the normal physiological conditions. So the next is transport of carbon dioxide. CO2 is carried by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin about 20 to 25%. CO2 is carried by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin about 20 to 25%. This binding is related to the partial pressure of CO2. PO2 is a major factor which could affect this binding. This binding is related to the partial pressure of CO2, and partial pressure of oxygen is a major factor which could affect this binding. When partial pressure of CO2 is high and partial pressure of oxygen is low, as in tissues, more binding of the carbon dioxide occurs, whereas when the partial pressure of PCO2 is low and partial pressure of oxygen is high, PCO2 is low and PO2 is high, as in alveoli, dissociation of CO2 from carbaminohemoglobin takes place. That is, CO2 which is bound to hemoglobin from the tissue is delivered at the alveoli. RBC contain a very high concentration of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and minute quantity of the same is present in the plasma too. The RBC contain a very high concentration of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and minute quantity of the same is present in the plasma too. This enzyme facilitates the following reaction in both direction. CO2 plus H2O in the presence of carbonic anhydrase gives reversible H2CO3. In the presence of carbonic anhydrase gives a reversible HCO3 negative plus H positive. At the tissue site, where partial pressure of CO2 is high due to the catabolism, CO2 diffuse into the blood, RBC in the plasma, and forms HCO3 negative and H positive. ठीक है, टिश्यू साइड में पार्शियल प्रेशर CO2 का हाई है, तो CO2 डिफ्यूज इनटू ब्लड एंड फॉर्म्स HCO3 नेगेटिव एंड H पॉजिटिव. ठीक है, क्या बनाएगी, HCO3 नेगेटिव एंड H पॉजिटिव डिफ्यूज होगी ब्लड में. ठीक है, at the alveolatory site where PCO2 is low, the reaction proceeds in the opposite direction, leading to the formation of CO2 and H2O. वहाँ पे फॉर्मेशन हो जाएगा CO2 और H2O का alveoli में. Thus CO2 is trapped as bicarbonate at the tissue level and transported to the alveoli is released out as CO2, and transported to the alveoli is released out as CO2. Every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood delivers approximately 4 ml of CO2 to the alveoli. यहाँ पे चेंज कर सकता है alveoli की जगह कुछ भी, बट करेक्ट है alveoli. Next is regulation of respiration. Human beings have a significant ability to maintain and moderate the respiratory rhythm to suit the demand of the body tissues. This is done by the neural system. Human beings have a significant ability to maintain and moderate the respiratory rhythm to suit the demand of body tissue. This is done by the neural system. A specialized center present in the medulla line of the brain called respiratory rhythm center is primarily responsible for this regulation. Another center present in the pons rhine of the brain called mnemotaxic center can moderate the function of the respiratory rhythm center. कौन से राइन में? पॉन्स राइन में ब्रेन के कॉल्ड निमोटैक्सिक सेंटर कैन मॉडरेट द फंक्शन ऑफ रेस्पिरेटरी रिदम सेंटर. किसका फंक्शन कर सकता है? मॉडरेट द फंक्शन ऑफ रेस्पिरेटरी रिदम सेंटर. न्यूरल सिग्नल फ्रॉम दिस सेंटर कैन reduce the duration of inspiration and thereby alter the respiratory rate. A chemosensitive area is situated adjacent to the rhythm center, which is highly sensitive to CO2 and hydrogen ion. Neural signal from this center can reduce the duration of inspiration and thereby alter the respiratory rate. A chemosensitive area is situated adjacent to the rhythm center, which is highly sensitive to CO2 and hydrogen ion. Increase in this substance can activate this center, which in turn can signal the rhythm center to make necessary adjustment in the respiratory process, by which this substance can be eliminated. Receptors associated with the aortic arc and carotid artery also can recognize changes in CO2 and H plus concentration and send necessary signals to the rhythm center for remedial actions. The role of oxygen in the regulation of respiratory rhythm is quite insignificant. यहाँ पे चेंज करके सिग्निफिकेंट कर सकता है और आपको पता भी नहीं चलेगा, बट करेक्ट है इनसिग्निफिकेंट वाला ट्रू स्टेटमेंट है. नेक्स्ट इज डिसऑर्डर ऑफ रेस्पिरेटरी सिस्टम्स. यहाँ पर से भी पक्का क्वेश्चन आता है. अस्थमा इज ए डिफिकल्टी इन ब्रीथिंग causing wheezing due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. Next is emphysema, is a chronic disorder in which alveolar walls are damaged, due to which respiratory surface is decreased. One of the major causes of this is cigarette smoking. Next is occupational respiratory disorders. In certain industries, especially those involving grinding or stone breaking, so much dust is produced that the defense mechanism of the body cannot fully cope with the situation. Long exposure can give rise to inflammation, leading to fibrosis, proliferation of fibrous tissue, and thus causing serious lung damage. Workers in such industries should wear protective masks. Now we are going to read the summary in a speedy way. Cell utilize oxygen for metabolism and produce energy along with the substance like CO2, that is carbon dioxide, which is harmful. Animals have evolved different mechanisms for the transport of oxygen to the cell and for the removal of the carbon dioxide from the air. We have a well-developed respiratory system comprised 2 lungs and associated air passages to perform this function. The first step in respiration is breathing, by which atmospheric air is taken in, that is inspiration, and the alveolar air is released out, that is expiration. Exchange of O2 and CO2 between deoxygenated blood and the alveoli. Transport of these gases throughout the body by blood. Exchange of O2 and CO2 between the oxygenated blood and tissues, and utilization of oxygen by the cellular respiration by the cells are the other steps involved. Inspiration and expiration are carried out by creating pressure gradient between the atmosphere and the alveoli with the help of specialized muscles, intercostals and diaphragms. Volumes of air involved in this activity can be estimated with the help of spirometer and are of clinical significance. Exchange of oxygen and CO2 at the alveoli and the tissue occur by diffusion. Rate of diffusion is dependent on the partial pressure gradient of oxygen, PO2 and CO2, that is PCO2, and their solubility as well as the thickness of the diffusion surface. As well as their solubility. These factors in our body facilitate diffusion of oxygen from alveoli to the deoxygenated blood, as well as from oxygenated blood to the tissues, from the alveoli to the deoxygenated blood as well as from the oxygenated blood to the tissues. The factors are favorable for the diffusion of CO2 in the opposite direction, that is from tissues to alveoli. Oxygen is transported mainly as oxyhemoglobin. In the alveoli where PO2 is higher, oxygen get bound to hemoglobin, which is easily dissociated at the tissue where PO2 is low and PCO2 and H plus concentration are high. Partial pressure of CO2 and H positive का concentration high. Nearly 70% of carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate, that is HCO3 negative, with the help of enzyme carbonic anhydrase. 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide is carried out by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin. In the tissues where PCO2 is high, it gets bounced to the blood, whereas in alveoli where PCO2 is low and PO2 is high, alveoli में PCO2 is low and PO2 is high, it gets removed from the blood. Respiratory rhythm is maintained by the respiratory center in the medulla rhyme of the brain. Respiratory rhythm is maintained by the respiratory center in the medulla rhyme of the brain. A pneumotaxic center in the pons rhyme of the brain and a chemosensitive area in the medulla can alter respiratory mechanism. A pneumotaxic center in the pons rhyme of the brain, a pneumotaxic center in the pons rhyme of the brain and a chemosensitive area in the medulla can alter the respiratory mechanism. Once again, a pneumotaxic center in the pons rhyme of the brain and a chemosensitive area in the medulla can alter respiratory mechanism. With this, we completed the chapter. Thank you for hearing.